The sun bled across the horizon, painting the vast, empty canvas of the western sky in strokes of fiery orange and deep violet. Dust, fine as powdered gold, rose in a soft plume behind the steady gait of Daisy, Lillian Green's dun mare, each hoofbeat a quiet, rhythmic punctuation in the immense silence of the plains. For Lillian, this silence was a balm. It was a stark contrast to the clatter of carriage wheels on Boston cobblestones, a sound that now seemed to belong to another life, another woman entirely. She drew a long, slow breath, the air crisp and clean, tasting of sagebrush and the coming chill of night. It was the taste of freedom, and it was the taste of survival. Willow Creek was a smudge in the distance, a collection of low-slung wooden buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the encroaching darkness. It was home, or the closest thing to it she'd had in the 3 years since her world had shattered. At 22, Lillian felt lifetimes older than the girl she'd once been. That girl, the daughter of Thaddeus Green, had known only the hushed comfort of velvet-draped drawing rooms, the polite tinkle of laughter at society balls, and the unshakable certainty that her future was as secure as the steel vaults in her father's bank. She shifted in the worn leather saddle, the rough texture a familiar friction against her sturdy riding skirt. She remembered the feel of silk and lace, dresses so delicate they seemed spun from morning mist. She had owned dozens. Now, she owned 2 durable calico dresses for the saloon, this riding skirt, and a simple wool frock for Sundays. The memory brought no tears, not anymore. The well of her grief had run dry somewhere along the dusty trail west, leaving behind a hard-packed riverbed of resolve. The Panic of '73 had not been a distant headline for the Green family. It had been a thief in the night, stealing not just their fortune but their very foundation. Her father, a man who had built an empire on trust and numbers, found himself broken by both. Lillian could still see him, sitting in his cavernous study, the ledgers open before him like an unreadable testament to his failure, his face a mask of gray despair. He had put a pistol to his temple 2 weeks later. Her mother, a woman as fragile and beautiful as the porcelain dolls in her collection, had simply faded, succumbing to a wasting sickness, the doctors called it. But Lillian knew its true name was heartbreak. Orphaned and penniless, with distant relatives offering only pity and platitudes. Lillian had sold the last of her mother's jewelry. She'd bought a train ticket west, as far as the money would take her, chasing a vague, desperate notion of reinvention. She had learned quickly that the world had little use for a woman educated in poetry and French, but a pretty face and a clear singing voice, that was a currency the West understood. And so, she had become the songbird of the Golden Spur Saloon. As Daisy crested the last rise, the full scope of Willow Creek lay before her. The main street was a wide, rutted artery, flanked by the general store, the blacksmith's forge already dark, the assayer's office, and the respectable facades of the doctors' and lawyers' practices. And there, in the center of it all, was the Golden Spur, its bat-wing doors already spilling yellow light and the faint, tinny sound of an out-of-tune piano onto the darkening street. It was a place of contradictions. It was loud, coarse, and smelled perpetually of stale beer, sweat, and cheap perfume. It was where rough men ranchers, miners, drifters came to wash away the grit of their hard lives with whiskey and fleeting entertainment. Yet, for Lillian, it was the one place she had found a fragile foothold. Martha, the saloon's stout, no-nonsense proprietor, paid her a fair wage, treated her with a gruff sort of respect, and ensured no customer's hands wandered too far. It was here, on a small, rickety stage, that Lillian Green ceased to be a tragic figure from a fallen Boston dynasty and became simply Lily, the singer with the sad eyes and the voice of an angel. It was a life of her own making, precarious and unrefined. But it was hers. A shadow was falling over that life, however, and it wore a silver star. As she guided Daisy down the main street toward the livery stable, She saw him. Sheriff Wade Thornton stood on the boardwalk in front of his office, his thumbs hooked into his gun belt, watching her approach. He was a handsome man in a harsh, weathered way, tall and broad-shouldered, with a square jaw and eyes the color of a stormy sky. Power clung to him like a second skin. In a town like Willow Creek, the law was what the sheriff said it was, and Wade Thornton wore his authority with an easy, unshakable confidence. For months, his attention had been a constant, low-grade pressure. It had begun with polite nods, then escalated to lingering conversations after her performances. He would buy her a sarsaparilla. His presence beside her at the bar, a clear signal to every other man in the room to keep their distance. At first, Lillian had been grateful for the buffer his presence provided, but his interest had curdled from protective to possessive. He spoke of her future as if it were a foregone conclusion, a property to be acquired. He talked of building a proper house for her at the edge of town, of making her a respectable wife, of saving her from the saloon. He never asked what she wanted. He simply assumed she would be grateful for the offer. He saw the broken society girl, the damsel in distress. He didn't see the woman who had clawed her way back from the abyss, who cherished her independence precisely because she knew how quickly it could be taken away. To marry Wade Thornton would be to trade one cage for another, gilded though it might be. It would be an end to the life she had forged for herself, and she would not allow it. "Evening, Miss Green," he called out, his voice a low rumble that carried easily in the quiet air. He pushed himself off the post he was leaning against and strode to the edge of the boardwalk, his boots making a heavy, authoritative sound on the planks. Lillian reined Daisy to a halt. "Sheriff," she replied, her voice even and polite. She had learned the art of the placid facade, a necessary skill for a woman alone in this world. "A long ride today?" he asked, his eyes sweeping over her. It wasn't a casual glance, it was an appraisal, the way a man might look at a fine horse he intended to buy. "You shouldn't be out so late on your own. It's not safe." "The land is peaceful, Sheriff, and Daisy is a reliable companion." She patted the mare's neck, the simple, honest warmth of the animal a comfort. "A horse is a poor substitute for a man's protection," he said, his smile failing to reach his cold eyes. "A woman like you, delicate and well-bred, doesn't belong in a place like this." "Not really. I could give you a proper home. Lillian, a name, the respect you deserve." There it was again. The offer wrapped in an insult, the proposal that sounded more like a threat. He was eroding her choices, trying to convince her that her only option was him. Her spine stiffened. The girl from Boston might have blushed and stammered. The singer from the Golden Spur met his gaze squarely. "I am grateful for your concern, Sheriff Thornton," she said, her tone cool and precise. "But I am quite capable of managing my own affairs. I have a home at the boarding house, and my name suits me well enough." A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. So quick she might have imagined it. He was not a man accustomed to being contradicted. He reached up, his hand closing possessively over the bridle, his knuckles brushing her gloved fingers. She instinctively pulled her hand back. "Don't be proud, Lillian," he said, his voice dropping lower, taking on a conspiratorial tone. "This is a hard country. It chews up and spits out people tougher than you. I'm offering you an anchor in the storm. You should think about taking it." He held her gaze for a long moment, his meaning clear. He was the storm, and he was the anchor. The choice was hers to make, but he had already decided the outcome. Finally, he released the bridle. "I'll see you at the saloon tonight," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. He gave a curt nod and turned, walking back to his office without another word. Lillian let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She urged Daisy forward, the short distance to the livery stable feeling like a mile. Every conversation with the sheriff left her feeling cornered. her carefully constructed world shrinking around her. He was patient. She'd give him that. He was circling her like a patient wolf, waiting for the moment she stumbled, the moment she gave in to fear and exhaustion. But tonight, something had shifted within her. The ride in the fading light, the vastness of the land, had reminded her of who she was now. She was not the fragile bloom from her mother's greenhouse. She was a wildflower, hardy and resilient, sprung from rocky soil. She had survived loss and poverty and the long, lonely journey west. She would survive Wade Thornton. Handing Daisy's reins to the stable boy with a soft word and a coin, she stepped back onto the main street. The piano music from the Golden Spur was louder now, a jaunty, slightly desperate tune that was the town's nightly heartbeat. It was time to go to work. As she walked toward the swinging doors, she squared her shoulders. She was no longer just surviving. She was fighting. Tonight, she would sing her songs, her voice rising above the noise and the smoke. A small act of defiance, and she would hold on to the one thing she had left, the one thing the sheriff could not simply take the right to say no. Her life was her own, and she would not let it be decided for her in the shadow of a silver star. The back alley behind the Golden Spur was a narrow channel of packed earth, a place of discarded barrels and the lingering scent of cheap whiskey. Lillian slipped out the rear door. Her performance finished for the night, the applause still a faint echo in her ears. The cool air was a relief after the stuffy, smoke-filled saloon. Instead of turning left toward the boarding house, she turned right, her steps quiet and purposeful in the moonlight. Moving away from the heart of the town, her path was not toward rest, but toward a small, private piece of solace she had discovered in the weeks since Hank Peterson had arrived in Willow Creek. The Triple Diamond Ranch sat on the western edge of town, its corrals sprawling out toward the open plains. It was a place of honest work and simple sounds, the snort of horses, the creak of leather, the low murmur of men who worked more than they talked. Hank Peterson was the newest hand, hired on for his uncanny way with horses. He was a man who seemed to have been carved from the same quiet, sturdy material as the land itself. He was not tall in the imposing way of Sheriff Thornton, but lean and wiry, with a stillness about him that was more comforting than intimidating. He had sun-crinkled eyes the color of worn denim and a mouth that was quicker to offer a wry, gentle half-smile than a full sentence. Their connection had been immediate and unspoken. It had started with a glance across the saloon, a moment of quiet recognition in a loud room. He never approached her with the forwardness of the other men. He would just watch her sing, his expression unreadable but attentive. And when she was done, he would give a single, slow nod before turning back to his drink. One afternoon, when Daisy had thrown a shoe, Lillian had led her to the Triple Diamond's forge. Hank had been there, calming the mare with a low voice and a steady hand, his touch both firm and gentle. He had spoken more to the horse than to her, but in the easy silence between them, something had been understood. They had started meeting in secret, a stolen quarter hour here and there. Sometimes it was by the creek that gave the town its name, sometimes in the quiet of the livery stable after everyone else had gone. They rarely talked of anything important. He would tell her about a difficult colt he was breaking, and she would describe a new song she was learning. But beneath the simple words, a current of deep affinity flowed between them. He looked at her not as a singer or a fallen woman, but as Lillian, and she saw in him not just a cowboy, but a man of profound and quiet strength, an anchor in the storm that was entirely different from the one the sheriff offered. She found him in the last corral, leaning against the fence under the vast, star-dusted sky. He was watching a young, skittish filly, a beautiful creature with a coat the color of moonlight. He wasn't trying to gentle her, just standing there, letting the horse get used to his presence. He heard her approach but didn't turn, a sign of trust that never failed to touch her. "She's a nervous one," Lillian said softly, coming to stand beside him at the fence. The sweet, clean scent of hay and horse surrounded them. a world away from the saloon. "She's got spirit," Hank replied, his voice a low, pleasant burr. "Just needs to learn that not every hand is a threat." He turned his head slightly, his gaze shifting from the filly to her. In the dim light, his eyes were kind. "You sang well tonight." "Thank you." A comfortable silence settled between them, a space she felt no need to fill with chatter. With Hank, silence was a conversation in itself. "Sheriff Thornton was there," she added, her voice barely a whisper. Hank's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "He's always there." It was a simple statement of fact, but she heard the protective anger simmering beneath it. He had seen the way Thornton watched her, the proprietary gleam in his eye. He had seen it from the very first night. "He spoke to me earlier," she continued, her fingers tracing the rough grain of the wooden fence rail. "Before my first set, he offered me his protection again. A house, his name." Hank said nothing, just turned his body fully to face her, leaning his back against the corral. He waited, letting her find her own words. It was one of the things she valued most about him. He never pushed, never presumed. He just listened. "It feels less like an offer and more like a closing door," she confessed, the words she couldn't speak to anyone else spilling out in the safety of the darkness. "Every day, the world he wants to build for me gets a little smaller, a little tighter. He thinks he's offering me respectability, but it feels like a cage." "Some cages are just bigger than others," Hank murmured, his gaze fixed on her face. "They put a roof over your head and call it shelter, but they forget to leave room for the sky." Her heart ached with gratitude for his understanding. He saw. He truly saw. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the question that had been haunting her for days, the question that had propelled her here tonight. "Hank," she began, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to keep it steady. "I have to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. It's not fair to ask, I know, but I have no one else." He just looked at her, his expression serious, waiting. "If it came to it," she said, the words rushing out now, "if I couldn't breathe here anymore, if I needed to leave this place, leave Willow Creek for good, and do it quietly, would you help me?" She held her breath, watching his face. It was an enormous thing to ask. It meant risking his job, his safety. It meant putting himself in direct opposition to the most powerful man in town, a man known for his vindictive nature. She was asking him to choose a side, to step out of the quiet shadows he preferred and into her trouble. Hank Peterson didn't hesitate. He didn't look away, didn't weigh the consequences. He simply looked at her, and in the space of a heartbeat, she saw his decision in his clear, steady eyes. "Yes," he said. The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a sacred vow. "You tell me when and where. I'll have the horses ready." A wave of relief so profound it nearly buckled her knees washed over her. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, not of sadness, but of a fierce, desperate gratitude. She had an ally. She had an escape. She was not, after all, completely alone. She could run. They could disappear into the vastness of the territory, find a new town, a new life, away from the shadow of the sheriff's star. The thought was a heady, intoxicating promise of freedom. She looked at him, at his calm, resolute face, and the path ahead seemed clear. They would leave, tonight, tomorrow, as soon as they could. But then, another thought took root, cold and hard as granite. If she ran, she would be running for the rest of her life. Wade Thornton would have won. He would have driven her from her home, from the small, independent life she had fought so hard to build. He would have proven his point that she was a woman in need of rescue, incapable of standing on her own. Fleeing would be an admission of defeat, a surrender of the very self-reliance she held so dear. The girl from Boston had been swept away by forces beyond her control. She would not let it happen again. A new kind of resolve settled over her, displacing the frantic urge to escape. It was a cold, quiet anger. This was her town as much as it was his. The Golden Spur was her stage. Her life was her own. "Thank you, Hank," she said, her voice stronger now, imbued with a purpose she hadn't possessed moments before. Knowing you would do that for me, it means more than I can ever say." She paused, meeting his gaze. "But I'm not going to run." He watched her, his expression shifting from resolute action to quiet inquiry. He didn't question her, just tilted his head slightly, waiting for her to explain. "This is my home," she said, the conviction growing with each word. "I have worked hard for my place here. It may not be much singing in a saloon, living in a boarding house, but it is mine. I earned it, and I will not be chased away from it by a bully who thinks he has the right to own me." She took a breath, the night air feeling clean and sharp in her lungs. "I'm not going to run from him. I'm going to face him." She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not surprise, but a deep, quiet respect. It was as if this was the answer he had been hoping for, the one he knew the real Lillian would give. He had offered her an escape route, but he admired her more for choosing the battlefield. He pushed himself off the fence and took a step closer. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the warmth and strength radiating from him. The space between them felt charged, intimate. "All right, Lillian," he said, his voice low and steady as a rock. "Then you won't face him alone." He didn't need to say more. It wasn't a promise of violence or a grand declaration. It was a simple statement of allegiance, a pledge that whatever came next, he would be there. A quiet, unshakable presence at her side. She looked up at him, at this silent cowboy who had seen the strength she kept hidden from the world. And for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel like a survivor anymore. She felt like she had a partner. "I have to go," she whispered, though she didn't want to. "Martha will wonder where I've gone." He nodded. "Be safe." She turned and walked back toward the lights of the town, her steps lighter than they had been in months. The fear of Sheriff Thornton was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But it was no longer a paralyzing dread. It had been transformed into a challenge. She did not know what the sheriff would do next, but she knew she would not be facing it alone. The quiet cowboy in the moonlight had given her more than the promise of an escape. He had given her the courage to stay. The air in the Golden Spur Saloon was thick enough to taste. It was Saturday night, and the place was teeming with the raw, restless energy of men who had spent their week wrestling a living from an unforgiving land. The room was a cacophony of sound, the sharp click of poker chips, the low rumble of a dozen conversations, the hearty laughter of a miner who'd had a lucky day, and through it all, the tireless, tinny melody of the piano, played with more enthusiasm than skill. A blue-gray haze of cigar smoke hung in the air, catching the yellow glow of the kerosene lamps and softening the edges of the rough-hewn room. From her small perch on the stage, Lillian Green saw it all. She was in the middle of her final song, a mournful ballad about a love lost on the Oregon Trail. Her voice, clear and pure, sliced through the noise, a silver thread weaving through a coarse tapestry. As she sang, she let her gaze drift over the sea of faces. She saw tired ranchers, their faces creased by sun and worry, dusty prospectors with the fever of hope still glinting in their eyes, and a few quiet townsmen, sipping their drinks and watching the controlled chaos. They were her audience, her livelihood, her community of strangers. Her eyes found him, as they always did. In the back, Hank Peterson was not a man who sought the center of a room. He stood leaning against the far wall, a half-full glass of beer held loosely in his hand. He wasn't watching her in the hungry, appraising way of the other men. His gaze was different, steady, quiet, and deeply attentive, as if he were listening not just to the words of the song, but to the story of the woman singing it. The memory of their conversation in the cool moonlight of the corral was a warm, secret strength inside her. Then you won't face him alone. His promise echoed in her mind, a silent counterpoint to the song's melancholy lyrics. Then her gaze was pulled, against her will, to the table directly in front of the stage. Sheriff Wade Thornton sat there, his chair tipped back at a confident angle. He wasn't drinking. He was simply watching her, a faint, proprietary smile on his lips. He looked like a man admiring a piece of property he was about to claim. His presence was a heavy weight in the room, a constant, low-level threat that kept the most raucous of the patrons in check and Lillian perpetually on edge. Tonight, his stare felt heavier than usual, charged with an unnerving purpose. She finished the song, the final, sorrowful note hanging in the air for a heartbeat before dissolving into a wave of applause and whistles. It was a hearty, genuine response. She had won them over, these rough men. For a few minutes, she had made them forget the dust, the debt, and the loneliness. She gave a small, graceful curtsy, the practiced gesture of a life she'd left behind. "Thank you, gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying over the din. She turned to step down from the stage, eager to retreat to the small dressing room Martha provided for her. But before her foot could find the step, a voice boomed through the saloon, silencing the renewed chatter. "Hold on a moment, Lily." Every head turned. Sheriff Thornton had pushed his chair forward, its legs scraping loudly on the wooden floor. He rose to his full height, his shadow swallowing the stage. The pianist's hands froze over the keys. The bartender paused, a bottle held mid-pour. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. Wade Thornton strode to the foot of the stage, his boots making a heavy, deliberate sound that echoed in the sudden, profound silence. He was a master of the dramatic entrance, a man who knew how to command a space. He didn't look at Lillian at first. Instead, he turned to face the crowd, his arms slightly spread, as if embracing them all in his authority. "Men," he began, his voice the confident rumble of law and order. "We all work hard to make Willow Creek a decent place, a place of order, a place where a man can build a future and a family. It's a town that needs foundations. It needs respectability." He paused, letting his words sink in. Lillian stood frozen on the stage, a butterfly pinned to a board. She could feel dozens of pairs of eyes on her, curious and confused. She had a terrible sinking feeling she knew where this was going. She glanced toward the back of the room. Hank was no longer leaning against the wall. He was standing straight, his body tense, his gaze locked on the sheriff. Thornton turned, his stormy eyes finally settling on Lillian. He took a step closer, placing one boot on the edge of the stage, an invasion of her space. He smiled, but it was a smile of ownership, not affection. "And respectability," he continued, his voice dropping to a more intimate, yet still public, tone. "Starts with our women. Miss Lillian Green here has graced us with her voice and her beauty for long enough in a place like this. She is a lady of quality, a delicate flower who has been planted in rocky soil." He reached out and took her hand. His grip was firm, inescapable. It's time she was given the life she was born for. A proper home, the protection of a good name. He looked back out at the crowd. Then his gaze returned to her, burning with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Lillian," he said, his voice loud enough for every man in the saloon to hear clearly, "I am asking you to be my wife." The silence that followed was absolute. It was deeper and more complete than before. It was the silence of pure, unadulterated shock. The idea of the town's most powerful man proposing to the saloon singer was the stuff of dime novels, a fantasy no one had actually expected to see play out. Lillian could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, a flush of humiliation and rage. He hadn't proposed. He had made a public declaration. He had backed her into a corner in front of the entire town, certain that she would not, could not refuse. For a moment, the frightened girl from Boston resurfaced. The path of least resistance was to murmur a yes, to accept the gilded cage and the life of quiet desperation it promised. It would be safe. It would be sensible. But then she felt the ghost of Hank's quiet strength at her back. She remembered her own resolve under the stars. My life is my own. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, and when she spoke, her voice was not the whisper of a frightened girl, but the clear, steady tone of a woman who knew her own mind. She gently but firmly pulled her hand from his grasp. Sheriff Thornton, she said, looking him directly in the eye, that is a very public gesture. I am honored by your consideration. She paused, letting the silence stretch. But I cannot accept your proposal. If a bomb had gone off in the Golden Spur, it could not have produced a more stunning effect. A collective, audible gasp swept through the room. Men stared, their mouths agape. This was not part of the story they had been expecting. The saloon singer did not turn down the sheriff. It simply wasn't done. Wade Thornton's confident smile faltered, then vanished completely. A dark flush crept up his neck, his face contorting first in disbelief, then in a cold, gathering fury. He had been publicly rejected, publicly humiliated. His authority had been challenged by the one person he believed he controlled. What did you say? He growled, his voice a low, dangerous threat. I said no, Lillian repeated, her voice unwavering, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. I thank you for the offer, but my answer is no. There's no reason for you to say no, he snarled, taking another step closer, his presence looming over her. Unless there's a reason you can't say yes. His eyes narrowed, suspicion dawning. There's another man. Isn't there some no-account drifter has filled your head with nonsense? He lunged forward and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. Who is he? Before Lillian could cry out, a sound cut through the tense standoff. Scrape! It was the sound of a wooden chair leg dragging across the floorboards in the back of the room. It was a simple, mundane noise, yet in the dead silence, it was as loud and definitive as a gunshot. Every eye in the saloon, including the sheriff's, snapped toward the source of the sound. Hank Peterson was walking forward. He moved with an unhurried, deliberate grace, his boots making almost no sound on the floor. He didn't push through the crowd. The men simply parted before him. Sensing that something momentous was about to happen, he walked past the poker tables, past the wide-eyed townsmen, until he reached the open space before the stage. He didn't look at the sheriff. His eyes were only for Lillian. In their denim-blue depths, she saw a question. Are you sure? She gave him the barest, almost imperceptible nod. It was all he needed. Only then did Hank turn his gaze to Sheriff Wade Thornton. He looked at the sheriff's hand, still clamped brutally on Lillian's arm. Then he looked up and met the man's furious stare. When Hank spoke, his voice was not loud, but it was calm and carried a weight that filled the entire saloon. Let her go, Sheriff, he said. Thornton laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. And who are you to tell me what to do? You're just a stable hand. You have no say in this. He tightened his grip on Lillian, a cruel display of power. This is between me and my future wife. Hank took one more easy step forward. He was now close enough to touch them both. He looked at Lillian, a softness in his eyes that was meant only for her. And then he looked back at the sheriff, his expression hardening into something as unyielding as iron. You're mistaken, Hank said, his voice still quiet, yet every single person in the room heard him clear as a bell. She already belongs to me. The second wave of shock that hit the saloon was even more powerful than the first. It was a silent, concussive blast. The quiet cowboy, the new man in town, had just laid claim to the sheriff's prize. He had drawn a line in the sand, not with a gun, but with 6 simple words. Thornton's face went white with pure, undiluted rage. He finally released Lillian, shoving her back slightly, his entire focus his entire being, now zeroed in on Hank. "You!" he spat, the word dripping with contempt. He looked Hank up and down, taking in the worn jeans, the simple cotton shirt, the lack of a lawman's star. "You think you can stand against me?" The air grew thick, electric with the promise of violence. This was how it happened in the West. A dispute over a woman, a challenge to a man's pride. The next step was a flash of steel and the roar of a gun. Thornton's right hand twitched, then slowly, deliberately, dropped until it hovered just inches above the worn leather handle of his Colt revolver. Hank didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just stood there, his hands loose at his sides, his gaze locked with the sheriff's. He was a still point in a turning, violent world. I said, "There will be no trouble in my place." A new voice, a woman's voice, sharp and hard as a whip crack, cut through the tension. Martha, the saloon's proprietor, had come from behind the bar. She was a mountain of a woman, with iron-gray hair in a tight bun and arms as thick as wagon spokes. And in her hands, she held a double-barreled shotgun, its twin muzzles pointing not at one man or the other, but at the empty space between them. She planted herself between the two men, a formidable, unmovable obstacle. "Wade Thornton, you know my rules. You take your fight out to the street. The lady gave you an answer. A decent man would accept it." She turned her sharp gaze on Hank. "And you, Cowboy, I don't know who you are, but you've made your point. Now stand down." The sheriff was shaking with a rage so profound he seemed about to burst. But he was trapped. To draw his gun now, with Martha and her shotgun between them and the entire town as his witness, would be the act of a madman. Not a lawman. His authority, already damaged, would be shattered completely. He glared at Hank over Martha's shoulder, his eyes burning with a hatred that was terrifying in its intensity. It was a look that promised a long and bitter reckoning. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "Not by a long shot." Without another glance at Lillian, he turned on his heel and stormed through the crowd, which parted for him like the Red Sea. The batwing doors burst open as he shoved his way out into the night, leaving a wake of stunned silence behind him. Slowly, shakily, the saloon began to breathe again. A low murmur rippled through the room as men turned to each other, their eyes wide. Lillian felt her legs tremble, the adrenaline finally giving way to a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Hank turned to her, his face etched with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She looked at him, this quiet man who had just risked everything for her, and then at the faces of the crowd, now looking at them with a mixture of fear, awe, and speculation. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the sheriff was right. This was not over. It had only just begun. The sun rose the next morning on a town that felt fundamentally changed. From the window of her small, tidy room at Mrs. Gable's boarding house, Lillian watched Willow Creek come to life. It looked the same, Mr. Henderson sweeping the boardwalk in front of the general store, the blacksmith's hammer beginning its rhythmic clang, a freight wagon rumbling down the main street, but a current of unseen energy ran beneath the surface of the mundane. People gathered in small clumps, their heads close together, their conversations stopping abruptly as they glanced toward the Golden Spur or the sheriff's office. The events of the previous night were no longer a private drama. They were public property, a piece of town lore being forged in real time. Lillian hadn't slept. She had spent the night staring into the darkness, her mind a whirlwind of replays, the sheriff's arrogant proposal, the suffocating silence, the feel of his fingers biting into her arm, and then, cutting through the fear, the image of Hank, the scrape of his chair, the quiet authority in his voice, the unwavering resolve in his eyes. He had stood for her when no one else would have dared. He had met the storm head-on, for her. A wave of warmth and a feeling so profound it stole her breath washed over her. It was more than gratitude, more than affection. It was a deep, resonant certainty that her heart, so long guarded and braced for hardship, had irrevocably been given to the quiet cowboy from the Triple Diamond. This fragile, newfound joy was a delicate thing, like a wildflower blooming in the shadow of a thunderhead. She knew the storm wasn't over. Wade Thornton was not a man to accept defeat, especially not a public humiliation of that magnitude. He would retaliate. The only questions were how and when. She was pouring water from the pitcher into her wash basin when a knock came at her door. It wasn't the soft, shuffling rap of Mrs. Gable, but a firm, authoritative knock. Her heart leaped into her throat. She already knew who it was. She took a moment to compose herself, smoothing the front of her simple wool frock, pushing a stray strand of hair back into her neat bun. She would not let him see her fear. She opened the door. Sheriff Wade Thornton stood in the hallway. He had removed his hat and held it respectfully in his hands. He was clean-shaven, his dark hair damp and neatly combed. He wore a clean shirt and a string tie. He looked less like the enraged man from the saloon and more like a concerned citizen paying a Sunday call. The transformation was more terrifying than if he had shown up breathing fire. "Miss Green," he said, his voice a low, polite murmur. "May I have a moment of your time? I won't keep you long." There was no polite way to refuse, not without creating the kind of scene she desperately wanted to avoid. "Sheriff," she replied, her own voice cool and even. She stepped back, allowing him to enter, but left the door wide open. The small room suddenly felt claustrophobic with him in it. He dwarfed her simple furniture, the narrow bed, the small writing desk, the single armchair. "I've come to apologize," he began, turning to face her. His expression was one of practiced sincerity. "My behavior last night was unbecoming. I allowed my feelings to get the better of me, and I put you in an unforgivable position. It was not the act of a gentleman, and for that, I am truly sorry." Lillian watched him, her mind racing. This was a tactic, a disarming maneuver. The apology was a weapon, and she didn't yet know how he intended to use it. Apology accepted. "Sheriff," she said simply, "we can consider the matter closed." "Ah, but that's just it, Lillian," he said, his voice laced with a counterfeit sadness. "I wish it were that simple. I am not here just to apologize for my actions, but to express my profound concern for yours." He took a step closer, forcing her to hold her ground or retreat. She held it. "You have made a grave error in judgment, and I fear you do not understand the consequences." "My judgment is my own affair," she stated, her chin lifting slightly. "As are the consequences." "Ordinarily, yes," he agreed with a condescending nod. "But not when you have attached yourself to a man like Hank Peterson." He said the name as if it were a foul taste in his mouth. Lillian felt a protective bristle, but she forced her expression to remain placid. "Mr. Peterson has been nothing but a gentleman to me." "A gentleman?" Thornton chuckled. A soft, patronizing sound. "My dear, you see a quiet stable hand who knows his way around horses. I see a man who is a complete mystery. Do you know where he came from before he drifted into Willow Creek a few months ago? Do you know what family he has? Do you know what name he went by before he called himself Peterson?" Each question was a carefully aimed dart, and she had no shield against them. The truth was, she didn't know. They had never spoken of the past. Their connection was rooted in the present, in the quiet understanding that existed between them here, in this town. She had never thought to ask, and he had never offered. In the West, many men preferred not to speak of what they'd left behind. A man's past was his own business, but now, Thornton was making it hers. "A man's past is his own," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "I judge him by the man I see today." A noble sentiment, the sheriff conceded, his stormy eyes boring into hers. But a foolish one, a dangerous one. "This is my town. Lillian, it's my duty to protect the people in it, and that includes you. Whether you want my protection or not, It's my job to know who is within my jurisdiction, and I will find out who Hank Peterson really is. The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare between them, cold and sharp. He would use the power of his office, the reach of the law, to dig into Hank's life, to unearth whatever secrets lay buried there, and he would use them against him, against them. You see, men like him, Thornton continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Men who appear from nowhere with no history. They're always running from something, a debt, a crime, a hangman's noose. He has the stillness of a man who has seen too much trouble. It's a look I recognize. And when his past finally catches up to him, and believe me, it always does, I would hate for a respectable lady like yourself to be caught in the wreckage. A cold dread began to seep into Lillian's bones. He was twisting the very qualities she admired in Hank, his stillness, his quiet strength, into something sinister. He was planting a seed of poison, and he knew she was fertile ground, because his accusations were built around a core of truth she knew nothing about the man she had allowed into her heart. She had to fight back. She could not let him see her waver. "Is that a threat, Sheriff?" she asked, her voice sharp. "It's a warning," he corrected smoothly. "From a man who still cares for your welfare, despite your poor choices. I'm giving you a chance to step away from him now, before it's too late, before whatever he is running from finds him here. Once I start looking into his past, the matter will be out of my hands. It will be official business." He was offering her an ultimatum. Abandon Hank, and he would call off his dogs. Stay with him, and he would unleash the full power of his office to destroy him. Lillian thought of Hank's face in the moonlight, his quiet vow to stand by her. She thought of his courage in the saloon. To abandon him now would be the greatest betrayal, a betrayal not only of him, but of the woman she was trying to become. "Your concern is misplaced, Sheriff," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even herself. "And your warning is not welcome. Hank Peterson is a good man. If you choose to harass him out of personal spite, that will be a reflection on your character, not his. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have preparations to make for my evening performance." She turned from him and walked to her small dressing table, a clear act of dismissal. She picked up a hairbrush, her hand trembling almost imperceptibly. She could feel his eyes on her back, cold and calculating. She had called his bluff. She had defied him once again. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence in the small room was thick with unspoken menace. Finally, he spoke. "Very well, Lillian," he said, his voice flat and devoid of its earlier false warmth. "You've made your choice. Don't say I didn't warn you." She heard his footsteps, the soft click of the door closing, and then, finally, she was alone. The hairbrush fell from her nerveless fingers, clattering onto the wooden floor. She sank onto the edge of her bed, her carefully constructed composure shattering like glass. He was gone, but his words remained, echoing in the quiet room. "Do you know where he came from? What name he went by?" She loved Hank. In her soul, she knew he was a good man. But love was not a shield against the past. What if Thornton was right? What if Hank was running from something? What kind of trouble had he known her mind, which had been so clear and resolved just moments before, was now a maelstrom of fear and doubt? She had placed her faith, her heart, and now her future, in the hands of a stranger, a kind, brave, wonderful stranger, but a stranger nonetheless. She rose and walked to the window, her gaze drifting west, toward the sprawling corrals of the Triple Diamond. She could see the distant figures of men working with horses, too far away to distinguish. Was he there? Was he thinking of her? Did he have any idea that the sheriff had just declared a silent, vicious war upon him? The gentle morning light that had seemed so hopeful earlier now felt harsh and interrogating, exposing all her uncertainties. She had refused to be imprisoned in the sheriff's gilded cage, but she was now trapped in a different kind of prison, the terrifying unknown of the past belonging to the man she loved. The sheriff's war began not with a bang, but with a whisper. By Monday morning, the whispers had become a low, persistent murmur that followed Lillian down the main street. It was in the way women in bonnets, gathered outside the general store, fell silent as she passed, their eyes following her with a mixture of pity and condemnation. It was in the way the men who only 2 nights ago had applauded her songs now averted their gazes, suddenly finding the dirt on their boots fascinating. Willow Creek, a town that had offered her a fragile sanctuary, was closing its ranks against her. She felt it most keenly inside Henderson's general store. The bell above the door announced her arrival with a cheerful, incongruous jingle. Mrs. Henderson, a woman whose face was permanently pinched in a state of mild disapproval, was measuring out flour for another customer. She looked up, saw Lillian, and her lips thinned into a razor line. She gave a curt nod and then deliberately, pointedly, turned her back to finish her task in slow motion, making Lillian wait. The store, which had been humming with quiet conversation, fell silent. Lillian stood by the counter, the object of intense, unseen scrutiny, feeling the heat of it on her skin. She was no longer just Lily, the singer. She was the woman who had publicly shamed the sheriff, the woman who had taken up with a rootless drifter. She had become a scandal. When Mrs. Henderson finally deigned to acknowledge her, her voice was cold and brittle. "What can I get for you?" Miss Green. The Miss Green was laced with a certain irony, a reminder of a respectability she had supposedly forfeited. Lillian kept her voice steady, refusing to be cowed. "A bar of your lavender soap, please, Mrs. Henderson." The woman retrieved the soap, her movements stiff, as she wrapped it in brown paper. She leaned forward slightly, her voice a conspiratorial hiss meant only for Lillian, but loud enough for the 2 women nearest the counter to hear. "A word of advice, dearie. A woman's reputation is a delicate thing. Once it's sullied, no amount of lavender soap can wash it clean." Lillian met her gaze, a cold fire kindling in her chest. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Henderson. I'll be sure to remember that." She placed her coins on the counter, took her package, and walked out, her back straight, her head held high, but the woman's words were like burrs, clinging to her, scratching at her composure. The whispers were a nuisance, the cold shoulders a minor pain. The true opening shot of the war was fired an hour later. It came in the form of a notice, nailed squarely to the message board outside the sheriff's office by Deputy Miller, a young man who couldn't quite meet anyone's eye. It was written in Wade Thornton's bold, authoritative script, the black ink stark against the white paper. "By order of the Sheriff of Willow Creek, effective immediately, under the statutes of this territory concerning vagrancy and the maintenance of public order, the individual known as Hank Peterson is hereby declared a disruptive influence. He is ordered to vacate the township of Willow Creek and its immediate environs within 48 hours. Failure to comply will result in his arrest and removal by force. Signed, Sheriff Wade Thornton." It was a declaration of absolute power, a tyrant's decree disguised in the language of the law. He hadn't charged Hank with a crime. He had simply erased him. A small crowd had gathered to read it, their faces a mixture of surprise and nervous apprehension. No one spoke. They just read the words, glanced at each other, and shuffled away, unwilling to be seen lingering, unwilling to choose a side. Lillian felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This was real. This was happening. The sheriff was using the full weight of his office not for justice, but for a personal vendetta. She turned and walked, almost ran, toward the Triple Diamond. She found Hank in the smithy, repairing a broken bridle buckle. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his small hammer was a steady, normal sound in a world that had just been tilted on its axis. He looked up as she entered, his face breaking into a slow, warm smile that faltered as he saw her expression. "Lillian, what is it?" he asked, putting the hammer down. She couldn't speak. She just handed him the crumpled copy of the notice she had torn from the board. He smoothed it out on the workbench, his eyes scanning the words. She watched his face, expecting to see anger, or fear, or surprise. But she saw none of those things. His expression settled into a familiar, weary stillness, the look of a man who had been expecting a battle and was not surprised that it had finally arrived. He read it twice, then, slowly, he looked up at her. "He's not wasting any time," he said, his voice quiet. "What are we going to do?" she asked, the words a frantic whisper. "We can't let him do this." Before he could answer, another man filled the doorway of the smithy. It was Silas Croft, the owner of the Triple Diamond. A grizzled man in his late 50s with a reputation for being as tough and as fair as the land he ranched. He held an identical notice in his hand. "Peterson," Croft said, his voice a low grumble. "I just saw this. It's a load of horse manure." He looked from Hank to Lillian, his shrewd eyes taking in the situation. "Thornton's been sniffing around, asking questions about you since Saturday night. Knew he was up to something." "He's got no right," Hank said, his voice flat. "The right's got little to do with it when the man with the star is a snake," Croft replied. He tossed the notice onto the workbench. "But he's made a mistake. He's put this out in public. Now it's a public matter." He looked directly at Hank. "You're a good worker. The best hand with a horse I've had in 10 years. This says you're a vagrant. A man with a steady job ain't a vagrant. It's a lie. Plain and simple. I'll go to him myself and say so." A flicker of hope ignited in Lillian's chest. They weren't entirely alone. Mr. Croft's support was a significant thing. He was a respected man in the community. "I appreciate that, Mr. Croft," Hank said. "Don't appreciate it. Just be ready for what comes next," the rancher warned. "Wade won't back down easy. This is about his pride, and a man's pride is a dangerous thing." He nodded at them both and left, his purpose clear. They were alone again in the quiet of the smithy, the air thick with the scent of hot metal and leather. Hank turned to her, his expression serious. "Lillian, he's doing this because of me, because of what I did in the saloon. Maybe the best thing is for me to just go. He'll leave you be if I'm gone." "No," she said, her voice fierce. She stepped closer and put her hand on his arm, feeling the hard muscle beneath his cotton shirt. "That's what he wants. He wants to isolate me, to prove that I can't survive without his protection. If you leave, he wins. We are not letting him win." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "But Hank, the things he said, the warning he gave me, he said you were running from something. He said Peterson might not even be your real name." The words tumbled out, the poison of doubt planted by the sheriff finally surfacing. "I trust you, but I don't know you, and he is going to use that against us." He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze searching her face. Then he nodded slowly, a deep sigh escaping his lips. "He's right about some of it," he said, his voice heavy. "Peterson is my mother's name. I took it when I came here, and I am hiding, but I'm not running from a crime I committed." He led her out of the smithy, away from the main ranch house, toward the creek that bordered the Triple Diamond property. They found a secluded spot under the shade of a large cottonwood tree, the gurgle of the water a soothing sound. He sat on a large, flat rock, and she sat beside him. He stared into the moving water for a long time before he spoke. "My given name is Henry Callan," he began, his voice low. "I was born in the Texas Panhandle. My father was a ranger, killed in a skirmish when I was a boy. I grew up fast and handy with a gun. For about 5 years, I made my living as a bounty hunter." Lillian's heart sank. A bounty hunter. The name conjured images of cold-eyed killers, men who hunted other men for money. As if sensing her thoughts, he turned to her, his eyes earnest. "It wasn't like some of them. Lillian, I wasn't a wolf hunting the weak. I worked with a group. We called ourselves the Regulators. We had a code. We worked for the circuit judges, tracking men with federal warrants, real outlaws, killers, bank robbers, and we brought them in alive. That was the rule. Always alive. We believed in the law, in giving a man his day in court, no matter what he'd done. He picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the water. It bounced 3 times before sinking. It's a hard life. It makes you enemies. Not just the men you bring in, but their families, their friends, and sometimes the lawmen you're supposed to be helping. He paused, gathering his thoughts. About a year ago, we were on the trail of the Miller gang. Vicious crew, robbed a stagecoach and killed 2 guards. We tracked them to a town called Red Rock, in Colorado territory. The town was run by a sheriff named Blackwood, a man a lot like Thornton, only meaner and twice as corrupt. Turns out, Blackwood was getting a cut of the Miller gang's loot. He was protecting them. We didn't know that. We went in, cornered 2 of the gang members in the saloon. There was a gunfight. When the smoke cleared, the 2 outlaws were down, and so was Blackwood's deputy. Blackwood claimed we'd shot his man in the back. It was a lie. The deputy was drawing on us. It was a clean shoot. But Blackwood saw his chance. He arrested my 2 partners. I managed to get away. He put a warrant out on all 3 of us. Murder! The pieces clicked into place. The weariness in his eyes, his quiet vigilance, his aversion to corrupt men in power. It was all rooted in this story. He wasn't a criminal. He was a man who had been betrayed by the law he'd served. My partners were tried in Blackwood's town by a judge he owned. Hank continued, his voice tight with remembered pain. They were hanged 2 weeks later. I was a witness who could clear their names and expose Blackwood. So the murder warrant on me became a death sentence. I've been on the move ever since, staying in small places, working with horses, trying to keep my head down until I can find a way to prove what really happened in Red Rock. He finally turned to look at her, his expression stripped bare, vulnerable. So, yes, Lillian, I'm hiding. I've been living a lie. The sheriff is right about that, and he will find that warrant. He'll use it to prove I'm a dangerous fugitive. He'll hang me if he can. She listened to his story, and a strange sense of peace settled over her. The fear and doubt that had plagued her since the sheriff's visit evaporated. This was the man she knew, a man with a code, a man who stood for what was right, even when it cost him everything. His past didn't make him a stranger. It made him whole. It was the story of how he had come to be the man who had stood for her in the Golden Spur. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers were calloused and strong, and they wrapped around hers. "You're not a fugitive. Henry Callan," she said, her voice filled with a conviction that was absolute. "You're a witness. Your partners were murdered by a corrupt sheriff, and you are the only one who can bring them justice." He looked at her, surprise and a flicker of hope in his eyes. "We are not going to let Wade Thornton or this Sheriff Blackwood win," she declared, her resolve hardening into steel. "You said there was a gunfight in a saloon. There must have been other people there. A bartender, customer, someone who saw what really happened." "There were," he admitted. "But they were too scared of Blackwood to speak up." "Then we will find them," Lillian said, her voice ringing with certainty. "We will find someone with a conscience, someone who is no longer afraid. We will get an affidavit, a testimony. We will find a witness, and we will clear your name, your real name." He looked at her, at this woman who was supposed to be a delicate flower, and he saw a strength that rivaled any man he had ever known. She wasn't just standing with him. She was ready to lead the charge. "Lillian," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "No," she interrupted softly, squeezing his hand. "We face this together. No more running. No more hiding." For the first time since he'd told his story, she saw the heavy weight of the past year begin to lift from his shoulders. A small, genuine smile touched his lips. In the shade of the cottonwood, with the threat of the law hanging over them, they had ceased to be 2 separate, embattled individuals. They had become a unified force, bound by a shared past and a future they would have to fight for. Together. The 48-hour deadline was set to expire on Wednesday at noon. The 2 days leading up to it were the longest of Lillian's life. Willow Creek was a town holding its breath, caught in the tense, unnatural quiet that precedes a violent storm. Business was conducted in hushed tones, and the usual boisterous energy of the Golden Spur Saloon was muted, as if even the most hardened drinkers were wary of sparking the town's simmering conflict. Lillian sang her songs each night, her voice a fragile beacon in the oppressive atmosphere, but she could feel the weight of the town's anxiety pressing in on her. She and Hank spent what little time they could together, not speaking of the looming deadline, but simply drawing strength from each other's presence. They were a united front, their silent resolve a stark contrast to the nervous chatter that had consumed the town. They had made their decision they would not run. They would face whatever came, together. Wednesday morning dawned gray and overcast, the sky a lid of dull pewter that seemed to press down on the world. At 11:30, Hank walked out of the Triple Diamond's main gate, his stride calm and measured. He was not dressed as a man preparing for a journey, but as a man going about his day. Silas Croft walked beside him, a grim set to his jaw. Lillian, who had been watching from the window of the boarding house, took a deep, steadying breath, pinned her hat in place, and walked out to join them. She took her place on Hank's other side. They stood together in the middle of the wide, empty street, facing the sheriff's office, waiting. Slowly, doors opened. People emerged from the general store, the blacksmith's forge, the hotel. They didn't come close, but they formed a silent, watching perimeter along the boardwalks, a mute audience for the final act of a drama that had gripped them all. They were a community of witnesses, their presence a silent, unreadable verdict. At precisely 12 o'clock, the door to the sheriff's office opened. Wade Thornton stepped out onto the boardwalk, his deputy, Miller, a nervous step behind him. The sheriff's face was a mask of grim satisfaction. He had waited, played by the rules of his own crooked game, and now he had come to claim his victory. He strode into the street, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust, stopping a dozen feet from them. "Well, Peterson," Thornton said, his voice loud enough for the entire town to hear, "your time is up. I trust you've packed your bags." Hank stood his ground, his hands loose at his sides. "I'm not going anywhere." "Sheriff?" Thornton's eyes narrowed. "That wasn't a suggestion. It's an order. You're in violation of a legal decree. Deputy, arrest him." The young deputy looked from the sheriff to Hank, then at the silent, watching crowd. He swallowed hard, his hand hovering uncertainly near his pistol. "Now hold on a minute. Wade," Silas Croft said, stepping forward. His voice was a low, powerful rumble. "You can't arrest a man for vagrancy when he's got a full-time job. He works for me. He draws a wage. Your order's based on a lie." "My order is based on the law," Thornton shot back, his authority absolute in his own mind. "I have deemed him a disruptive influence, and that's the end of it. This is my town, and I will maintain order in it. Now, stand aside, Silas, or you'll be charged with obstructing an officer of the law." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. This was no longer just about a cowboy and a singer. This was about the sheriff using his star as a club to settle a personal score. "This ain't order, Wade. It's a grudge, and every soul in this town knows it." The sharp, commanding voice belonged to Martha, who now stood on the saloon steps, her arms crossed over her formidable chest. "You were shamed in my saloon, and now you're using your badge to punish the man who stood up to you and the woman who turned you down. It's a sorry sight." The crowd's murmur grew louder, a sound of discontent that was beginning to find its voice. The sheriff's face darkened with fury. He was losing control. "This man," he roared, pointing a trembling finger at Hank, "is not who you think he is. He is a wanted fugitive. I have a telegraph from a Sheriff Blackwood in Colorado. He's wanted for the murder of a deputy." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was the trump card Thornton had been holding, the secret weapon he believed would silence all dissent. Murder. The word hung in the air, ugly and final. Lillian's heart pounded, but she stepped forward, her voice ringing out in the sudden silence. "And is Sheriff Blackwood an honorable man, or is he a man like you? Sheriff Thornton, a man who twists the law to serve his own ends." "That's enough," Thornton snarled, his composure finally snapping. "I've had enough of this circus. Miller, I gave you an order. Arrest him now." He drew his own pistol, not to fire, but as a final, brutal assertion of his power. The crowd fell back, a wave of fear washing over them. But as the deputy reluctantly stepped forward, a new voice, calm and measured, spoke from the edge of the crowd. "I don't think that will be necessary. Sheriff?" All heads turned. An old-fashioned carriage had pulled to a stop at the end of the street, and from it stepped a tall, slender man in a black frock coat. He was older, with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing, even without a badge. He radiated an authority that dwarfed the sheriff's. It was Judge Isaac Parker, the circuit judge, a man known throughout the territory for his sharp mind and his intolerance for corruption. A wave of relief visibly washed over the townspeople. His arrival was a godsend. "Judge Parker," Thornton stammered, his face paling. He quickly holstered his weapon. I wasn't expecting you for another week." "I concluded my business in Dusty Gulch sooner than expected," the judge replied, his gaze sweeping over the scene: the armed sheriff, the nervous deputy, the defiant trio in the street, and the silent, watchful crowd. "And it seems I've arrived just in time. There appears to be a matter of some public dispute. Perhaps we should discuss it in a more civilized venue, the town hall. I believe—" It was not a request, it was a command. The town hall was packed to the rafters within 20 minutes. It was not a formal trial, but a town meeting with the weight of a legal hearing. Judge Parker sat at the head table, flanked by the town clerk. Sheriff Thornton stood on one side, Lillian and Hank on the other. The citizens of Willow Creek filled every available bench, their faces tense and expectant. The judge began, his voice calm and reasonable. "Sheriff Thornton, please explain the situation to me. You were about to arrest this man. On what grounds?" Thornton, having regained some of his composure, presented his case. He spoke of his duty to maintain public order, painting Hank as a drifter of unknown character who had caused a public disturbance. He presented his expulsion order as a reasonable, legal measure. Then, for his grand finale, he produced the telegraph. "Furthermore, Your Honor, I have received this communication. This man, who calls himself Peterson, is in fact Henry Callan. He is a wanted fugitive, with a warrant for the murder of a peace officer in Colorado." He read the telegraph aloud, his voice ringing with triumph. He had expected the words to settle the matter, to damn Hank in the eyes of the judge and the town. Judge Parker listened impassively. When Thornton was finished, he turned his cool gaze on Hank. "Mr. Callan, is this true? Are you the man named in this warrant?" "Yes, sir, I am," Hank said, his voice clear and steady. The crowd stirred, a low buzz of shock. "And did you murder this deputy?" the judge asked, his eyes sharp and probing. "No, sir, I did not." And then, with simple, unadorned honesty, Hank told his story. He spoke of the regulators, of their code to bring men in alive. He described the Miller gang and the corrupt Sheriff Blackwood. He recounted the gunfight in the Red Rock Saloon, how the deputy had drawn on them, and how Blackwood had framed him and his partners to protect his criminal enterprise. He spoke of his friends, hanged for a crime they didn't commit, and of his flight, not from justice, but from a fatal injustice. He didn't raise his voice or plead for pity. He just stated the facts as he knew them, his quiet sincerity more powerful than any theatrical denial. When he was done, a profound silence filled the hall. The judge then looked at Lillian. "Miss Green, You seem to have a vested interest in this man's fate. What can you tell this assembly about his character?" Lillian stood, her hands clasped before her. "Your Honor, I cannot speak to what happened in Colorado. I can only speak of the man I have known here in Willow Creek. I have known Henry Callan to be quiet, hard-working, and gentle. I have seen him calm the most frightened of animals with a soft voice and a steady hand, and I have seen him stand up to a powerful man, not with violence, but with courage, to defend my honor when no one else would." Her eyes briefly met the sheriff's. "The man Hank has described a man who believes in the law and stands against corruption. That is the man I know." Judge Parker nodded slowly. "Mr. Croft, you are his employer." Silas Croft rose, his weathered face set in grim lines. "Judge, I hired him 2 months ago. He's the best worker I've got. He's honest, he's reliable, and he's caused no trouble. This expulsion order is a farce. It ain't about vagrancy, and it ain't about public order. It's about the sheriff's bruised pride." A murmur of agreement went through the hall. The tide of public opinion, which had been hesitant and fearful, was now turning into a powerful current against the sheriff. Judge Parker steepled his fingers, his gaze finally settling on Wade Thornton, who was beginning to look like a trapped animal. "Sheriff," the judge said, his voice taking on a hard, judicial edge. "Let us examine the facts. First, you issue an order of expulsion against a man for vagrancy who is gainfully employed by a respected member of this community. That, on its face, is a misuse of the statute." He picked up the telegraph. "Second, you receive a warrant from another territory. The proper legal procedure would be to request official extradition papers from the governor, to be served by a U.S. Marshal. You have done no such thing. You have merely used this uncorroborated piece of paper as a cudgel in a personal dispute." He leaned forward, his eyes like chips of ice. "Third, and most troubling, you have used the power of your office, the trust this town has placed in you, to intimidate and harass citizens to settle a personal grievance. You have created the very public disturbance you claim to be preventing." The judge stood up, his voice filling the hall. "This assembly is not a court of law. I cannot rule on the guilt or innocence of Mr. Callan concerning the events in Colorado, but I can rule on matters within my jurisdiction, and it is my judgment that you, Sheriff Thornton, have grossly overstepped your authority. Your order of expulsion against Henry Callan is hereby null and void." A collective sigh of relief, followed by a ripple of applause, swept through the room. "Furthermore," the judge continued, silencing the crowd with a raised hand, his gaze still locked on the sheriff, "I am putting you on notice. This territory is governed by law, not by the whims of men with badges. Any further harassment of Mr. Callan or Miss Green will be met with a full investigation into your conduct, and I will personally recommend your immediate removal from office. Do I make myself clear?" Wade Thornton stood frozen, his face a mottled canvas of fury and humiliation. He had been publicly stripped of his power, his authority dismantled before the very people he sought to rule. He managed a single, clipped nod. "Clear, Your Honor. This meeting is adjourned," the judge declared. The spell was broken. The room erupted in conversation as people rose from the benches, a palpable sense of release in the air. They filed past Hank and Lillian, many of them offering a quiet nod of respect or a soft word of encouragement. They had been tried in the court of public opinion, and they had been vindicated. Sheriff Thornton, isolated and ignored, pushed his way through the crowd and disappeared out a side door. In the near-empty hall, Hank turned to Lillian. The weight of a year on the run had lifted from his shoulders, replaced by a profound, bone-deep gratitude. He looked at her, this woman who had believed in him, who had refused to let him run, who had faced down the town's most powerful man for his sake. "You said we'd find a way," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I said we would," she replied softly, her hand finding his. Together, they had won. It wasn't the end of their troubles. The warrant in Colorado still existed. But it was a monumental victory. They had faced the storm and, with the help of a few good people and the true spirit of the law, they had emerged into the calm on the other side. In the quiet aftermath of the town hall meeting, Willow Creek seemed to exhale. The oppressive tension that had held the town in its grip dissipated, replaced by a sense of communal relief and a newfound respect for the quiet cowboy and the saloon singer who had refused to be broken. For Lillian and Hank, it was a victory, but a fragile one. They had won the town's heart, but the shadow of Wade Thornton's hatred remained, a poisonous stain on their newfound peace. And beyond that, a larger shadow loomed the warrant from Colorado and the name of Sheriff Blackwood. That evening, they met not in secret, but openly, at their place by the creek. The moon was a perfect silver coin in the black velvet sky, its light filtering through the cottonwood leaves to dapple the ground. The water murmured its endless, soothing song. They sat on their familiar rock, not speaking for a long time, simply absorbing the reality of all that had happened. Finally, Hank turned to her, his face serious in the moonlight. "Lillian," he began, his voice low and earnest. "What we have, what you've done for me, I've never known anything like it." He took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "We won today, but Thornton is still here, and that warrant is still out there, staying in Willow Creek. It's like waiting for the other boot to drop." "I know," she whispered, her heart aching at the thought of leaving the small, fierce life she had built. But she knew he was right. Their victory had made them legends in the small town, but it had also made them targets. "I want more for you than this," he continued, his gaze intense. "More than a life of looking over your shoulder. I want to give you a real life, a safe one, a place where you can sing without fear, where we can walk down the street without the whole town watching." He took a deep breath, and she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his steady eyes. "Lillian, I don't have much to offer. I don't have a fine house, or a fortune, or even a name that isn't tied up in trouble right now. All I have is my heart, and my hands to work for you, and a promise that I will spend the rest of my days standing between you and any storm that comes." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple, silver band. It wasn't ornate or jeweled, but it shone brightly in the moonlight, a perfect, unbroken circle. "I know this isn't the way it's supposed to be done," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can't imagine a single day of the life I want to build without you in it. Lillian Green, will you marry me? Will you be my wife and let me be your husband? And we'll face down the rest of it, whatever it is, together." Tears welled in her eyes. Tears of a joy so pure and profound it felt like a prayer being answered. His proposal was everything Wade Thornton's had not been. It was private, not public. It was a humble question, not an arrogant demand. It was an offer to build a future together, not an attempt to own her. "Yes," she breathed, the word a release of all the love and hope she had kept locked inside her. "Oh, Hank, yes." He slipped the simple silver band onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He drew her close, and in the quiet sanctuary of the moonlit creek, he kissed her, a kiss that sealed their promise and marked the true beginning of their life. Their decision was made. They would leave Willow Creek. They would find a place where Henry Callan and Lillian Green could become Mr. and Mrs. Callan, a place where their past could not so easily find them. They decided on Bozeman, in Montana Territory. It was a bigger town, a bustling hub on the trail west, a place where two new faces could be absorbed without much notice. Their departure was quiet, but not without its farewells. Silas Croft shook Hank's hand, pressing a bonus into it that was far more than he had earned. "You're a good man, Callan," he said, using Hank's real name with a nod of respect. "Don't let any tin-star tyrant tell you different." Martha, from the saloon, pulled Lillian into a rough, surprising embrace. "You give 'em hell, girl," she whispered fiercely. "You find a place where your voice can really soar." She pressed a small, heavy purse into Lillian's hand. That's your share. And then some. You earned it." They left at dawn 2 days later, with their few belongings packed onto a sturdy mule. As they rode out of town, they didn't look back. Ahead of them, the sun was rising, painting the mountains in hues of rose and gold, promising a new day and a new beginning. The journey to Bozeman was a balm to their spirits. The vast, open country was a tonic, washing away the claustrophobia of their final weeks in Willow Creek. They spoke of the future, of the small home they would build, of the simple life they craved. For the first time, Lillian felt the heavy weight of her past, the loss of her family. The fall from grace truly began to lift. It was no longer the defining story of her life. The story now was of the man riding beside her, and the future they were riding toward. Bozeman was everything they had hoped for. It was a town teeming with life and energy, nestled in a valley surrounded by majestic, snow-capped mountains. It was a place looking forward, not back, a place of commerce and construction and opportunity. They found a small, clean cabin for rent on the edge of town, with a sturdy stone fireplace and a window that looked out onto the mountains. 3 days after they arrived, they were married. They found a preacher, a kindly old man with a gentle smile, and in a simple ceremony with only the preacher's wife as a witness, they exchanged their vows. Lillian Green became Lillian Callan, standing beside her husband, her hand in his, a sense of peace so complete it felt like coming home after a long and arduous journey settled over her. Their life took on a simple, happy rhythm. Hank, with his skill and quiet demeanor, easily found work at a large livery stable, his wages more than enough to support them. Lillian, emboldened by their new start, auditioned to sing at the Grand Gallatin Hotel, the finest establishment in Bozeman. It was a world away from the Golden Spur. The stage was polished, the room was filled with well-dressed travelers and prosperous local merchants, and the piano was perfectly in tune. Her voice, freed from the oppressive atmosphere of Willow Creek, had never sounded better. The hotel manager hired her on the spot. For 6 months, they lived in a state of quiet bliss. They were building a home, filling their small cabin with the simple comforts of a shared life. Hank built her a bookshelf for the few volumes she owned. She planted a small herb garden by the door. They were Mr. and Mrs. Callan, a normal, happy couple. The shadows of Sheriff Thornton and Sheriff Blackwood began to recede, fading like a bad dream in the bright morning of their new reality. They were safe. They were happy. They were free. It was a crisp autumn evening when the dream ended. Lillian had just finished her final set at the hotel. The applause was warm and appreciative. She smiled, her eyes scanning the room for her husband. He was at their usual table in the back, a proud, gentle smile on his face. She felt a now familiar surge of love for him, so powerful it almost hurt. This life, this moment, was more than she had ever dared to hope for. She curtsied to the audience and stepped down from the stage, making her way toward him. As she passed the hotel entrance, 2 men stepped inside, their presence immediately striking a discordant note in the elegant lobby. They wore city suits and bowler hats, but they moved with the stiff, purposeful gait of lawmen. One of them approached the hotel manager, speaking in a low voice and showing a piece of paper. The manager's face went pale. He pointed a trembling finger toward Hank's table. Lillian's blood ran cold. She quickened her pace, a nameless dread seizing her. The 2 men walked toward their table, their path intersecting hers. Hank saw them coming and slowly, deliberately, stood up. "Henry Callan," the taller of the 2 men asked. His voice was flat, official. "That's my name," Hank replied, his body calm, but his eyes were alert, watchful, already assessing the threat. "We have a warrant for your arrest, issued by the office of the territorial governor." And then, a third figure stepped out from the shadows of the hotel's grand entrance, moving into the lamplight. He was not in a city suit. He wore his familiar dusty boots and gun belt, but he had on a new coat and a look of absolute, triumphant malice. It was Wade Thornton. "Hello, Lillian," he said, his voice a smug drawl that cut through the genteel murmur of the lobby. "It's been a while. Did you really think it was over?" Lillian stared at him, speechless. He looked like a specter from a past she thought she had escaped, a ghost who had followed them from their old life to haunt their new one. Thornton sauntered over, a thick, official-looking document in his hand, sealed with a prominent wax stamp. He held it up for them to see. "You see," he said, his eyes glinting with cruel satisfaction. "Judge Parker may have his opinions about local matters in Willow Creek, but the governor of the territory? Well, he has a much broader view of the law, and as it happens, he's my uncle, a very dear uncle, who was quite disturbed to hear about a wanted fugitive who had been allowed to run free. He was even more disturbed to hear that this same fugitive had enticed a woman of good standing away from her home, under what can only be described as false pretenses." He unrolled the document with a flourish. His voice dropped, but it was pitched to carry, a performance for the small, shocked crowd that was beginning to gather. "By the authority vested in him by the government of the United States, the governor has issued this executive warrant. It supersedes any local judgments. Henry Callan, you are charged with violating a lawful expulsion order, and—" He paused, his eyes locking onto Lillian's with pure venom. "With the moral crime of illicit enticement, you are to be taken into custody immediately." The world tilted. The beautiful, safe life they had built in Bozeman shattered into a million pieces. This was not a flimsy, local order they could fight in a town meeting. This was a warrant from the highest power in the territory, brought by the one man in the world who would stop at nothing to destroy them. Wade Thornton smiled, a predator's smile. He had them, and this time, there was nowhere left to run. The elegant lobby of the Grand Gallatin Hotel, a space of polished wood and velvet upholstery, transformed in an instant into a courtroom of cold, hard reality. The two lawmen, territorial marshals by their demeanor, flanked Hank, their faces impassive. They were merely instruments of a power far greater than their own. The real force in the room was Wade Thornton, who stood basking in the glow of his long-awaited vengeance, his smile a venomous slash in the dim light. "You can't do this," Lillian said, her voice a low, fierce tremor. She moved to Hank's side, her hand finding his, their fingers locking together in a desperate, unbreakable grip. "This is a personal grudge, not the law." "On the contrary, my dear Lillian," Thornton purred, his condescending gaze sweeping over her. "This is the law in its purest form. The will of the governor, the highest authority in this territory. The days of small-town judges and sentimental rabble are over." He nodded to the marshals. "Take him." There was no struggle. Hank knew that resistance here, in this place, was futile. It would only end in violence and play directly into Thornton's hands, allowing him to add more charges. He gave Lillian's hand a final, reassuring squeeze, his eyes conveying a message of calm strength that he did not feel. "It's all right, Lillian," he murmured, his voice for her alone. "We'll face this." They led him away, out of the warm light of the hotel and into the cold darkness of the street. The shocked patrons of the hotel lobby stared, whispering amongst themselves, their evening's entertainment having taken a dark and unexpected turn. Lillian stood frozen for a moment, the warmth of Hank's hand still imprinted on her own. Thornton lingered behind, savoring his victory. "I am his wife," she said, her voice sharp with defiance as she turned on him. "I will be at the hearing." Thornton's smile widened. "Of course you will," he said. "The hearing is scheduled for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, in Magistrate Albright's chambers. The governor felt it best to expedite the matter, to settle it without any unnecessary public spectacle. It was a sham, and they both knew it. A hastily arranged hearing in a private chamber, presided over by a magistrate appointed by the governor himself. It was not a trial. It was a formality, a legal stamp to be placed on a decision that had already been made. He was not just arresting Hank. He was demonstrating the awesome, inescapable reach of his family's power. The night was the longest of Lillian's life, longer even than the night after the Saloon confrontation. She sat in their small, beloved cabin, the home they had built together, now feeling like a temporary shelter on the edge of a cliff. Every object, the bookshelf Hank had built, the woven rug she had bought at the market, the 2 tin coffee cups that sat side by side on the shelf, was a testament to a life that was about to be ripped away from them. The next morning, she walked into the territorial courthouse, a building of imposing stone meant to symbolize the permanence of the law. Magistrate Albright's chambers were paneled in dark, somber wood. The room was small, containing only the magistrate himself, a portly man with a nervous tic and eyes that refused to meet hers, Wade Thornton, the 2 marshals, and Hank, who stood between them, his face a stoic mask. The proceedings were a bitter farce. Magistrate Albright read the charges from the governor's warrant, his voice droning and devoid of interest. The first charge was violating the Willow Creek expulsion order. Lillian's lawyer, a young, earnest man named Mr. Davies, whom she had hired that morning, immediately objected. "Your Honor, that order was publicly nullified by Judge Isaac Parker." Davies argued. Magistrate Albright cleared his throat, shuffling papers on his desk. Judge Parker's ruling pertained to the enforcement of the order within his circuit. It did not, and could not, erase the fact that the order was legally issued by a sitting sheriff. Mr. Callan's failure to comply within the original 48-hour period remains on the record as a violation. It was a perverse twisting of logic, a legal loophole manufactured for one purpose. The second charge was even more insidious: the illicit enticement of Miss Lillian Green, a resident of Willow Creek, causing her to abandon her community and livelihood under the influence of a man of dubious and fugitive character. Lillian felt a surge of pure rage. They were painting her as a witless victim, a foolish woman led astray. It was an attempt to invalidate not only her love, but her very mind. "I will speak to that charge," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that made the magistrate jump. Before her lawyer could restrain her, she stood. "My name is Mrs. Lillian Callan," she stated, her eyes locking on the magistrate. Though her words were aimed at Thornton, "I was not enticed. I was not influenced. I am a grown woman who made a conscious and deliberate choice. I chose to leave a place where the law was used as a tool of personal vengeance. I chose to build a life with my husband, a good and honorable man who was being unjustly persecuted. The only crime committed here is the abuse of power by a man who cannot accept the word no." Her words hung in the oppressive silence of the room. Magistrate Albright flushed a deep red. Wade Thornton's face was a thundercloud. "Your testimony is noted, Mrs. Callan." The magistrate stammered. He looked to Thornton, a clear, subservient glance for direction. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. After reviewing the warrant issued by the governor, Albright read from a prepared statement. "And hearing the testimony, this court finds that there is sufficient cause to act. The charge of enticement is a moral rather than a criminal one, and is dismissed in a legal sense." He was throwing Thornton a small, face-saving bone. However, the violation of a lawful order is a serious matter. It demonstrates a contempt for the authority that maintains peace in this territory. He looked at Hank, his gaze finally direct and cold. "Henry Callan, you are hereby ordered to vacate the Montana Territory. You have 48 hours to be across the territorial line. If you are found within its borders after noon on Friday, you will be arrested and sentenced to 5 years of hard labor. This judgment is immediate and not subject to appeal." It was a death sentence of a different kind. Banishment, to be cast out. A man without a home, without a territory to call his own. The hearing was over. The marshals led Hank from the room, to be held until the deadline. Lillian stood alone, her lawyer offering useless words of sympathy. Wade Thornton approached her, his face a mask of false concern. "I am truly sorry it came to this. Lillian," he said, "this is for the best. You are free of him now. You can come back to Willow Creek. I will take care of you. I will still give you my name." She looked at him, and the last of her fear was burned away, replaced by a contempt so profound it was almost pity. "You haven't won. Wade," she said, her voice quiet, but filled with the strength of her conviction. "You haven't freed me. You've only shown me exactly who you are, and I would rather live in the wildest, most desolate wilderness with my husband than in the finest house in the world with a man like you." She turned and walked out, leaving him standing alone in the dark, empty room. She spent the next day and a half in a flurry of desperate, secret activity. She sold the few items of value she owned, a silver-backed hairbrush from her old life, a locket of her mother's. She bought 2 sturdy horses, packs and supplies, dried meat, flour, coffee, blankets, a rifle, and ammunition. She did it all through intermediaries, stable boys and the wives of miners who lived on the edge of town and had no love for the high-handed territorial authorities. On Friday morning, an hour before the deadline, Hank was released from the local jail. 2 marshals escorted him to the southern edge of town, a public display to ensure the governor's order was seen to be carried out. They watched him as he started walking south, a lone figure on a long, empty road. They watched him for a full 10 minutes. Then, satisfied, they mounted their horses and rode back toward the courthouse. They did not see the rider, who emerged from a thicket of aspen a mile down the road. It was Lillian, leading a second horse, packed and ready. Hank swung into the saddle, his face grim, but his eyes alight with love and gratitude when he saw her.
"Lillian, you shouldn't have,"
he whispered, his hand covering hers on the reins.
"He'll come after you too."
"He already has," she replied simply. "You are my husband. Your home is my home. Your road is my road. Now let's ride." They turned their horses not south, toward the more traveled passes, but west, toward the jagged, unforgiving spine of the mountains. They rode hard, pushing the horses, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and Bozeman. They entered the mouth of a deep, winding canyon, its towering rock walls a sheer, protective barrier. The trail was narrow and treacherous, but it was a path where they were unlikely to be followed. As dusk fell, they found a small, sheltered alcove, a shallow cave carved into the canyon wall by centuries of wind and water. It offered protection from the wind and concealment from the rim above. They built a small, smokeless fire, the horses tethered nearby. They were fugitives, their world reduced to what they could carry on their backs, the vast, indifferent wilderness their only sanctuary, the weight of what they had lost, the beautiful, simple life they had so briefly enjoyed, settled heavily upon them. As they sat huddled together for warmth, a wave of dizziness washed over Lillian. She pressed a hand to her forehead, the familiar feeling she had been dismissing for weeks as stress or fatigue returning with a sudden, undeniable clarity. The morning sickness she'd occasionally felt, the deep, bone-weary exhaustion in the afternoons, the subtle changes in her own body she had been too preoccupied to truly notice. In the flickering firelight, surrounded by the immense, silent darkness of the canyon, she understood. She looked up at Hank, at his beloved face, etched with worry and exhaustion. She saw the man who had faced down sheriffs and corrupt judges for her, the man who was now in exile for her. And she knew that their story was not just about loss and escape. It was about to become a story of creation. "Hank," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and of fierce, burgeoning hope. He looked at her, his expression full of concern. "What is it, Lily? Are you all right?" She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We aren't just running for ourselves anymore," she said, her eyes filling with tears that were not of sorrow, but of a love so powerful it defied their desperate circumstances. "You're going to be a father. I'm carrying our child." The revelation in the canyon changed everything. The raw, desperate flight for survival became a sacred, urgent mission to protect a future. Hank looked at Lillian, then at her hand covering her stomach, and the weight of their predicament was momentarily eclipsed by a wave of pure, unadulterated awe. A child, their child, in the midst of their exile, in the heart of the wilderness. They had created life. His fear was immense, a cold, sharp thing that pierced through his weary resolve. But stronger than the fear was a surge of fierce, primal protectiveness that was more powerful than anything he had ever known. He was no longer just a man running from his past. He was a father guarding the future. They couldn't stay in the canyon. It was too exposed, too transient. For the next few weeks, they moved carefully through the rugged backcountry west of Bozeman, a nomadic existence dictated by caution and the changing needs of Lillian's pregnancy. Hank, using skills he hadn't relied on in years, became their provider. He hunted deer and trapped rabbits, his movements as silent and efficient as a ghost. He learned the landscape, the game trails, the hidden springs, the places where a man could live and not be seen. Lillian, in turn, made their succession of temporary camps into homes. She learned to cook over an open fire, to stretch their meager supplies, to mend their worn clothes with a patient, steady hand. They found their sanctuary in a place that had been forgotten by the world. Tucked away in a high, secluded valley, miles from any known trail, was an abandoned line shack. It had likely been built by a trapper decades ago and long since deserted. The roof was sagging and the door hung on one leather hinge, but the log walls were solid and the stone fireplace was intact. To them, it was a palace. Their life fell into a harsh, demanding, yet deeply intimate routine. The changing seasons marked the passage of time. Autumn's gold gave way to the stark, skeletal beauty of early winter. The world shrank to the confines of their small valley. Hank spent his days hunting, trapping, and stockpiling firewood, his face growing leaner, his eyes ever more watchful. Lillian's world became the small, warm circle of the cabin. Her body changed, her pregnancy becoming more pronounced, a constant, miraculous reminder of what they were fighting for. There were days of profound loneliness and gnawing fear, the silence broken only by the wind in the pines. But there were also moments of a quiet, perfect happiness that they had never known even in the relative comfort of Bozeman. They would sit by the fire at night, her head on his shoulder, his hand resting on the swell of her belly, feeling the faint, fluttering kicks of the new life within. In their isolation, they became more than husband and wife. They were a single, self-reliant unit, their love the quiet, steady heartbeat of their small, hidden world. Winter arrived not gradually, but in a single, furious onslaught. The sky, which had been a clear, cold blue, turned to a churning mass of gray. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that grew into a deafening roar. And then the snow began, not in gentle flakes, but in a blinding, horizontal torrent. They were sealed inside the cabin, the world outside erased by a swirling vortex of white. It was on the second night of the blizzard that Lillian's labor began. The pain started low and deep, a tightening that stole her breath. There was no doctor, no midwife, no neighbor to call for help. There was only Hank, his face a mask of terror and fierce resolve in the flickering firelight. He boiled water, tore their cleanest blankets into strips, and held her hand, his voice a low, steady murmur of encouragement, a calm anchor in her sea of pain. The storm outside raged, a symphony of chaos. The wind shrieked, and the snow beat against the small cabin, which groaned under the assault. Inside, a drama more elemental and profound was unfolding. Lillian fought with a strength she didn't know she possessed, her body consumed by the powerful, agonizing rhythm of childbirth. Hank was her rock, wiping her brow, speaking to her, his love a tangible presence in the small, warm room. In the deepest, darkest hour of the night, as the blizzard reached its zenith, the sound of the storm was pierced by a new sound, a thin, reedy, yet miraculously strong cry. Their child had been born. She was small and perfect, with a fuzz of dark hair and her father's serious, watchful eyes. They wrapped her in the warmest, softest part of a wool blanket and held her between them. The howling of the wind seemed to soften, the fury of the storm receding in the face of the small, warm miracle in their arms.
She needs a name,
Lillian whispered, her voice weak but filled with an overwhelming love. Hank looked at his daughter, then at his wife, his heart so full it felt it might burst. "We should call her Hope," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears.
"Because that's what she is."
For 3 days, the storm continued, cocooning them in their own private world. They were a family. The fear of the outside world, of Thornton and warrants and governors, seemed a distant, half-forgotten nightmare. Their reality was the warmth of the fire, the taste of snow melted for water, and the soft, snuffling breaths of their daughter, Hope, sleeping against her mother's chest. On the 4th morning, they awoke to a world transformed. The wind had died. The world outside their small window was a pristine, untouched wilderness of brilliant white under a piercingly blue sky. The beauty of it was breathtaking. It felt like a benediction, a sign that their ordeal was over. The illusion of peace was shattered an hour later by the sound of approaching horses, their progress muffled by the deep snow. Hank was instantly on his feet, the rifle he always kept loaded in his hand. He peered through a small chink in the cabin wall. His body went rigid. "Lillian," he said, his voice a low, urgent warning. "Stay with the baby. Don't make a sound." There were 3 riders. 2 were the familiar territorial marshals. The man in the lead, sitting his horse with an air of smug triumph, was Wade Thornton. He had found them. The tracks Hank had been forced to leave in the snow just before the blizzard, or perhaps the thin wisp of smoke from their chimney, had been enough for a skilled tracker. Thornton dismounted, his boots sinking into the deep snow. He strode to the cabin door, a thick roll of paper in his hand. He didn't bother to knock. He kicked the door open, the broken leather hinge giving way completely. He stood there, framed in the doorway, the brilliant winter light behind him, a dark specter of vengeance. His eyes took in the scene, the humble cabin, the fire, Hank standing with a rifle. And then his gaze fell on Lillian, sitting up in the simple bed, holding a tiny, blanket-wrapped bundle. A flicker of surprise, then a look of pure, curdled malice crossed his face. "Well, well," he sneered. "What have we here, a cozy little domestic scene? How touching." "Get out, Thornton," Hank said, his voice a low growl. The rifle held steady. "This is my home. You have no authority here." "That's where you're wrong, Callan," Thornton said, holding up the paper. "I have all the authority I need. Another warrant, straight from the governor's desk. It seems you've been a busy man." He unrolled the document with a snap. "You are hereby charged with the kidnapping of one Lillian Green, a crime to which her current state of obvious distress and confinement will attest."
"That's insane,"
Lillian cried out, her voice trembling with rage.
"I am his wife. I came of my own free will."
"A marriage conducted under a false name. To a wanted man, I doubt any real court will recognize it." Thornton shot back. "Which brings us to the second charge impersonation, posing as a lawfully married couple, Mr. and Mrs. Callan. A clear attempt to defraud the good people of this territory. It seems you've graduated from a simple fugitive to a kidnapper and a con man. It's a hanging offense. This time, it was the masterstroke of a madman. A web of lies so perverse and twisted that it was almost brilliant. He was trying to legally erase their love, their marriage, their family. "You won't take him," Lillian said, her voice rising, a mother protecting her young. "I won't let you." "You don't have a choice," Thornton said, his eyes glinting. He nodded to the marshals, who dismounted, drawing their own weapons. The situation was hopeless. Hank was one man, with one rifle, against 2 armed lawmen and a man driven by a monomaniacal hatred. But as the marshals took a step forward, Another sound broke the pristine silence of the valley, the crunch of snowshoes. Approaching with a steady, determined rhythm. A figure emerged from the tree line, a tall, slender man in a heavy winter coat, his face ruddy from the cold. He was alone, but he walked with an air of absolute command. It was Judge Isaac Parker. Wade Thornton stared, his jaw dropping in disbelief. "Judge what? What are you doing here?" "A good question, Mr. Thornton," the judge said, his voice calm and cold as the winter air. "I could ask the same of you. I was under the impression your official duties were confined to Willow Creek." "I am acting on a direct warrant from the governor," Thornton blustered, holding up the document as if it were a holy relic. Judge Parker didn't even glance at it. "Ah, yes, the governor," he said, his tone laced with ice. "Your uncle has been a very busy man. So busy, in fact, that his activities have attracted the attention of federal authorities. It seems he has a habit of issuing irregular warrants and of taking a financial interest in certain criminal enterprises, like, for instance, the one run by a corrupt sheriff in Colorado named Blackwood." Thornton's face went white. The judge continued his relentless advance until he stood directly in front of Thornton. "When I learned that your uncle had issued yet another personal warrant, and that you had taken it upon yourself to lead a posse into the wilderness, I decided to follow. I suspected I would find you at the end of this trail, perpetrating yet another gross abuse of power." He finally looked at the warrant in Thornton's trembling hand. "Kidnapping impersonation. These charges are not just baseless. They are an insult to the law itself. This woman," he said, nodding respectfully to Lillian, "is here of her own accord, as she has stated previously. This man," he turned to Hank, "is her husband, and this child is their legitimate heir. This warrant, Mr. Thornton, is nothing more than the final, pathetic act of a spurned bully." He turned to the two marshals. "Gentlemen, you are officers of the territory, not a private army. You are witnessing a felony in progress, the harassment of a family under the false color of law. You can either be party to it, or you can stand with the legitimate authority in this valley, which, at this moment, is me. Holster your weapons." The marshals looked at each other, then at the judge's unyielding face, then at the crumbling facade of Wade Thornton. They had seen enough. They slowly, deliberately, put their pistols back in their holsters. The judge turned back to Thornton, his voice dropping to a low, final judgment. "It's over. Wade, your uncle has been recalled to Washington to answer for his corruption. His political career is finished. He can no longer protect you. This warrant is worthless. All the warrants are worthless. You have no power here. You have no power anywhere." Wade Thornton stood there, the warrant fluttering from his nerveless fingers to the snow. The malice in his face dissolved, replaced by a look of utter, empty defeat. He was a hollow man, his entire identity built on a power that was no longer his. He was nothing. "Go home, Wade," the judge said, his voice softer now, almost weary. "Just go home." Without another word, Thornton turned, stumbled through the snow to his horse, and rode away, a solitary, broken figure disappearing into the vast, white wilderness. He did not look back. The judge stepped into the small cabin, his stern expression softening as he looked at Lillian and the baby in her arms. "Mrs. Callan," he said, his voice filled with a gentle respect. "It seems my congratulations are in order." He looked at the newborn, a rare, small smile touching his lips. "What is her name?" Lillian looked down at the tiny, sleeping face of her daughter, and then up at her husband, who was lowering his rifle. The great, terrible weight of the past finally, truly, lifted from his shoulders. "Her name," Lillian said, her voice clear and strong in the quiet cabin, "is Hope." The years that followed were not a grand, sweeping epic, but a quiet, steady composition of ordinary days, each one a precious note in the melody of a life rebuilt. The terror of the past did not vanish overnight. It receded slowly, like a tide going out, leaving behind the high water marks of memory, but no longer threatening to drown them. Judge Parker had been true to his word. The governor's corruption had been exposed, and he had been disgraced. The warrant from Colorado, issued by the now imprisoned Sheriff Blackwood, was officially expunged. The name Henry Callan was cleared, washed clean not by violence, but by the slow, grinding machinery of true justice. They returned to Bozeman not as fugitives, but as free people. They bought back their small cabin with the money Martha and Silas had given them, a tangible link to the life they had been forced to abandon, and slowly, they wove themselves back into the fabric of the town. Hank, with his cleared name and solid reputation, eventually bought the livery stable where he had once worked, his quiet competence and honest dealings earning him the respect of the entire community. He was no longer the mysterious drifter, but Mr. Callan, a man of substance, a pillar of the town. Lillian never returned to singing in hotels. Her voice, once a tool for survival, was now reserved for joy. She sang lullabies to her daughter, hymns in the small white church on Sundays, and cheerful tunes at community gatherings. She was not Lily, the saloon singer, nor was she the tragic Miss Green from Boston. She was Lillian Callan, a wife, a mother, a woman who had found her own kind of respectability, one that came not from a man's name or a fine house, but from the quiet dignity of a life well lived. 7 years after the blizzard that had brought both terror and hope, the Callan family walked through the cheerful chaos of the Bozeman summer fair. The air was warm and thick with the scents of roasted corn, fresh cut hay, and the sweet, sticky perfume of spun sugar. The fairgrounds were a kaleidoscope of color and movement, a joyful testament to the peace and prosperity of the valley. Hank, his face weathered by the sun but softened by a constant, gentle happiness, walked with his daughter perched confidently on his shoulders. At 6 years old, Hope Callan was a whirlwind of bright, curious energy. She had her father's steady, denim blue eyes and her mother's radiant smile. She was the living, breathing embodiment of their second chance, a child of the wilderness who was now perfectly at home in the heart of a bustling community.
"Papa, look, a puppet show!"
she squealed, pointing a small, excited finger toward a brightly painted stage where a wooden knight was valiantly battling a green cloth dragon. "We'll go see it, Sweet Pea." Hank laughed, his deep voice rumbling with affection. He looked over at Lillian, who walked beside them, and his eyes were full of a love so profound it needed no words. Lillian smiled back, her heart swelling with a quiet, perfect contentment. She watched her daughter, her small face alight with wonder, and her husband, the steady, honorable man who was the center of her world. They were a family, whole and unbroken. The ghosts of the past seemed a million miles away, creatures of a different, darker world that could not touch them here in the sunlight. They bought Hope a bag of sticky popcorn and found a bench to watch the puppet show. The simple, silly story captivated the small girl, and Lillian found herself laughing along with her, a pure, uncomplicated sound of joy. In this moment, everything was right. The world was good. It was as the puppet show ended, and the small crowd began to disperse, that Lillian saw him. He was standing by the corner of a livestock pen, a solitary figure adrift in the sea of happy families. The initial sight of him was a physical jolt. A cold sliver of ice slid into the warmth of the day. Her breath caught in her throat, and her hand instinctively tightened on Hank's arm. Hank followed her gaze, and the easy smile on his face vanished, replaced by a familiar, watchful stillness. "Wade," he said, his voice a low, flat statement. It was Wade Thornton, but it was as if they were looking at a faded, water-damaged photograph of the man they had once known. The arrogant, broad-shouldered confidence was gone. replaced by a slump of permanent weariness. His clothes were worn and dusty, the clothes of a man who moved often and slept rough. His face was thin, his jawline blurred by an unkempt beard, and his eyes, those once stormy, commanding eyes, were hollowed-out things, empty of fire, empty of everything but a vast, desolate exhaustion. He was the ghost of the tyrant he had once been. He wasn't looking for them. He seemed to be looking at nothing at all, just staring into the middle distance. But then, as if drawn by the intensity of their gaze, his head turned, his empty eyes met theirs. For a long moment, no one moved. The joyful noise of the fair seemed to fade into a distant hum. Lillian's heart, which had leaped with a primal, instinctual fear, slowly settled. This was not the sheriff. This was not a threat. This was just a man, lost and broken. Slowly, Thornton began to walk toward them, his gait the shuffling, aimless walk of a drifter. Hank stood up, placing himself almost unconsciously between his family and the approaching man. But his posture was not aggressive. It was the stance of a man protecting his ground, not one preparing for a fight. Hope, sensing the sudden shift in her parents, grew quiet, her blue eyes wide with curiosity as she looked at the sad-faced stranger. Thornton stopped a few feet away. He looked at Hank, at the quiet strength and stability that had defeated him. He looked at Lillian, at the calm, unwavering peace in her face that he had never been able to touch. And finally, he looked at the small girl, the child with her father's eyes, the living proof of the life they had built in the ashes of his attempts to destroy them. A strange, complicated expression flickered across his face, a hint of the old bitterness, a touch of regret, and something else, something that looked almost like resignation. "Callan," he said, his voice a hoarse, dusty rasp, a faint echo of the booming authority it once held. "Mrs. Callan." He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Thornton," Hank replied, his voice even, devoid of triumph or malice. Thornton's gaze lingered on Hope for a moment longer. "She's a fine-looking girl," he said, the words strangely devoid of any emotion. He then looked back at them, at the solid, unbreakable unit they presented. He seemed to finally understand, in a way he never could have before, the nature of what he had lost, or rather, what he had never had the capacity to possess. "You got what you wanted," he said, and it wasn't an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact. "We built what we wanted," Hank corrected him, his voice quiet but firm. Wade Thornton held their gaze for another long second, and then he gave a single, tired nod. "Be happy," he said, the words almost a whisper. And then he turned and walked away, not looking back, a solitary, gray figure that was quickly swallowed up by the bright, swirling colors of the fair. He was gone. Not a villain vanquished, but simply a sad story that was no longer a part of theirs. Lillian let out a long, slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was the final exhalation of a fear she had carried for years. The last ghost had been laid to rest. Hope tugged on her father's sleeve. "Papa, who was that man?" she asked, her small brow furrowed. Hank swung her down from his shoulders and knelt to her level, his expression softening once more. "He was just someone we used to know a long time ago. Sweet pea," he said gently. "He's not a part of our story anymore." Lillian watched them, her husband and her child, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon sun. She looked around at the joyful, ordinary chaos of the fair, at the mountains standing sentinel in the distance, at the vast, blue sky above. She saw the long, tangled thread of her life, and for the first time, she could see it whole. She saw the frightened, grieving girl leaving Boston, the determined singer in the smoky saloon, the terrified woman in the courthouse, the exhausted fugitive in the wilderness. Every loss had been a lesson. Every hardship had been a forge. Every choice, Every act of defiance, every moment of terror, and every flicker of hope had been a necessary stepping stone on the path that had led her here. To this bench, to this summer fair, to this man and this child, to this profound and unshakable peace. It was a peace that had been earned, paid for in full with tears and courage. It was real, and it was theirs. She reached out and took her husband's hand, her simple silver wedding band catching the light. He looked up at her, and in his eyes, she saw her own story reflected back at her, a story of survival, of love, and of a quiet, extraordinary victory. It was, she knew, the end of the chase and the beginning of forever. Thank you for listening to this story. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like the video, and give your support by hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.